So it's hard to tell even what's written by a human and what's not. And the pace of information is just exploding. That the natural reverberation of that is to go back to center. That if you have access to everything everywhere all at once, not to have the cliche of the movie, that you have, as a human who's designed to be in community, like we are designed to be, we are pro-social beings. God made us to essentially care for one another biologically, which is why your brain releases oxytocin and serotonin when you help someone, empathy for someone. Your brain is wired to be in community. I think there's this reconciliation. It's like, we've gone too far. How do I balance that? How do I come back? And so I think, not to be just optimistic or naive or naively optimistic, I do think the reverberation of everything synthetic everywhere all at once actually brings us back to center, to a healthy perspective.
Hello, Bible lovers. Welcome to another episode of Unscrolled, Museum of the Bible's podcast about the history, narrative, and ongoing impact of the Bible on our society today. That's a good lead into the conversation that we're going to have today. A very special guest to talk about the topic that's in everybody's mind and mouth and lives right now, AI. We're here together with Nathan Chappell.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So glad to be here with you. It's just, let me introduce you first before I dive deep into the topic. I think it's just appropriate to talk about the human behind the technology and the topic before we do that. But for people to understand a little bit more who you are, you're the Chief AI Officer at Virtuous, a software company or in a nonprofit space.
Yeah.
Chief AI Officer, that's pretty unusual a title. I haven't heard that much. And you're an AI innovator, you're an author, you're a consultant. You just did a couple of keynotes that you spoke at. So you're a sought after person just because this topic is so big. But you mainly operate in the nonprofit space, right?
Yeah, I mean, I started out as a technologist, found myself as an accidental fundraiser, which basically meant that an executive director at a board I was serving on quit, and I was naive enough to say I would step in, and found myself for 17 years leading nonprofit organizations. But around 2017, went back to my tech roots and built the first algorithm to predict generosity. So I have a few patents on this idea of gratitude prediction and machine learning. And really at the time, 2017, 2018, I realized that AI was going to have a profound impact on humanity, and became, fairly vocal and concerned about, how that technology be used for good. So I've really dedicated the last 8 or 9 years on what would be considered responsible and beneficial AI. So not just AI that's ethical and private and secure, but that promotes human flourishing, and that will actually, do net good. And so, yeah, it's been a really interesting ride for the last, 8 or 10 years. And was a lot before generative AI came out, before ChatGPT. So it went from this kind of nascent, inaccessible technology to something, to your point, that everyone's talking about.
Mm-hmm. Before we dive into the topic of AI, and we can spend hours on it, we'll have about 80 minutes or 60 to 80 minutes. But what do we need to know about Nathan outside of your professional work? Who are you?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's a complex question. It's interesting because I grew up in poverty. So, my mom was really hardworking, single parent, grew up with my sister and I, and my mom, very close family unit. And, didn't have a lot to give, but my mom was very deliberate about teaching the virtues and values of giving back. And I remember my first fundraiser. I actually did a fundraiser when I was 8 years old. We had a family friend who almost drowned in a swimming pool, and the family incurred medical bills. And, while we didn't have a lot of money, my mom really instilled this idea of like, everyone has something to give. And I remember standing out in front of the local pizza shop doing a fundraiser. And I just found recently a news clipping that the newspaper, I guess, took a picture of this happening. And I think that was really set me on that path. Now, I never really thought about that as a career most of my life. I got a business degree. I actually started a few businesses, was going to go work in Madison Avenue for a while. And then the nonprofit sector found me. And I think this is a divine intervention thing where I was really never motivated by money. And so the business side didn't feel right. And I allowed God to open that door, and I, pulled the thread and then found myself in this just amazing career where I could just be, work among incredible people that wake up every day believing in the power of we and humanity and how we can come together and solve problems. And so, yeah, it's been a kind of a wild journey that I did not expect at all.
What did faith play in your upbringing?
What was that?
What role did faith and
Oh,
the Bible
faith.
play in your
Yeah.
upbringing?
Oh, very strong. Yeah. So, grew up in actually Lutheran and then evangelical covenant denomination. And that was just something that became a big part of, our family identity. And so, in fact, from a generosity perspective, there was a time at our house where the roof was like actually caving in. It was like leaking, water was pouring in. And I remember distinctly, probably in junior high, where a bunch of men from our church literally came over and re-roofed our entire house. And still to this day, I love woodworking and working and helping other people build things. And I think a lot of it stems from just seeing that the church as a community coming together to support each other. So yeah, it still remains a really integral part of my life.
Mm. Um, Typically, when you talk to people about AI, they want to sell you something or they have an idea what to use, what the latest tool is. And when we got to know each other at an event, I was so impressed by you not taking that role. You were listening, you're giving context. You're an interesting uh, species, that you're not necessarily an AI researcher, somebody like Stuart Russell, or the safety
Right.
advocate like Tristan Harris, or you're not a philosopher like John Lennox,
Right.
right? You're
Right.
not an entrepreneur like what's her name? Mira Murati, for
Right.
example, right? So you kind of none but all of it, and you kind of put all of this together, kind of to build a perspective to help people to deal with this incredibly complex topic.
Yeah, I guess I'm, more of like the AI practitioner, pragmatist in a way. I not smart enough to be most of those people, but I have a heart for humanity, and I believe in the power for people to come together. I understand enough about technology and how it works. I mean, I've started a few tech companies, and in fact, when AI came out, well, I mean, AI came out in 1955, but in around 2017, 2018, when I started diving into what AI represented, I knew nothing about it. I decided to become the most annoying person on the planet. I ended up hiring a few companies to help build models. I hired a PhD, and I embraced being annoying. And I asked every question I could possibly ask of, why this and why that, and what if we did this and what if we did that. And I realized that kind of my nature of being, ADHD and just always bored, I became good at asking questions. And so, realizing now that almost lack of discipline, growing up, would be considered a lack of discipline, and your inability to like learn in a straightforward way has become a superpower. And as that the curious generalist, the person who just asks what if better and more often than other people, they really thrive in the age of AI because it's not a static technology; it's a recursive, self-improving technology. So yeah, and it's perfect for someone like me because AI is never going to stay the same. Every day, every week, as the headlines. I mean, things just happen and unfold at this unprecedented pace. So it keeps you on your toes. And if you like learning, AI is the place to be.
Yeah. I want to frame the discussion a little bit. Still, next session, next part of framing, who you are as a person, a little bit about the technology and what's happening in society right now for those people who, I don't want to say live under a rock, but I haven't really haven't heard much about what the impact of AI is. And for some of us, it might be just a kind of a help to summarize all the things that are
Yeah.
going. So NVIDIA has become the most valuable company in the world, chip maker. DeepSeek releases wiped out large stock value in a single day. Graduates boo AI advocates
Yeah.
at commencement speeches. Hollywood writers and actors protest against AI and don't know what exactly to do with it. There's an open letter from pioneers warning about the existential risk, while other industry leaders race to be more powerful than the others, striking big deals with government governments and companies. Pastors openly admit to writing their sermons with
Yeah.
AI. People creating Jesus chatbots. ChatGPT and other assistants actually replacing pastoral care, where people ask their AI agent what to make of life and how
Mm-hmm.
to deal with situations. It can be quite daunting. How do you
Yeah.
navigate this?
Yeah, I mean, this is the term, a lot of like behavioral researchers will call cognitive dissonance and it's become such a, I don't know, most relevant topic because if you have a technology or anything that represents ultimate promise and at the same time represents ultimate doom, it becomes very difficult for your brain to actually compute. You're inundated. I mean, the average person right now interacts with between 4 to 5,000 algorithms per day. So every swipe on your phone is essentially an algorithm, essentially vying for your attention, feeding you information. And that sense of overwhelm that comes from that, just when you have all the world's knowledge, all the world's information at your fingers, it can be overwhelming to a point. And I think we probably will dive into this. Almost you become numb to it in some cases. And so, my wife's an English major, and all of a sudden one day her news feed, which looks very different than my news feed, started giving her articles about like all these things that were horrible things that were going to happen. And she texts me like, well, I didn't know about this, and all these things are going to happen. And it just becomes overwhelming for people to distill all of this. Now, at the end, there's a tremendous amount of hype. I mean, there's really three things around AI universally right now: is fear, FOMO, and fatigue. And the fear is that, if you have technology that knows something about everything and can seemingly do anything, I mean, we're on this very exponential path to like AI working autonomously very quickly in the next two phases of AI. So we're kind of in baby phase right now still, or maybe adolescent phase. That's why it's so unpredictable and chaotic. So the fear part, the FOMO is like, am I ahead? Am I behind? Am I using it right? Should I be using it to write a letter, or should I be using it to create a business? And should it work for me, or should I work for it? And then the fatigue part is probably, the part that I see a lot, which is people are just like, I'm tired of it. I'm tired of all of it. And I just want to go back to like,
How
farming
things were
and
before.
gardening. And yeah, I mean, there's such a reverence for the 90s right now. If you've seen this with younger people, um, now, I grew up in the 90s and it was kind of brutal, but I don't want to go back. But I will say that there was a more simplistic time where things seemed to be a bit more authentic in a way, from like cassette tapes and even the resurgence of like LP records.
Yeah.
There's a yearning for people to kind of go back to a simpler life. And I think that's actually a very positive outcome of like this atomized society. And I think we'll see more of that actually.
Mm. Um, I want to loosely structure our conversation around, what is it, 8 topics. Not really just touching everyone, but yeah, I think it's a helpful guidance for people at home, people listening or watching this, when they do their research, to look at the different topics, the perspectives on
Mm,
how to look at
yeah.
technology. I want to talk about what is AI, actually understanding a little bit. I want to talk about human nature, truth and knowledge.
Well,
I want to talk work and creativity. Right? We want to talk about relationships and community, power and justice. And we'll talk about faith and specific Christian ethics, and then hope for the future, if there is any. Uh, this
yeah.
is this is a
Yeah.
book. This is
That's
a
a lot.
series
That's
of
a
talks,
lot.
right?
Yeah.
So
We're going to cover
we're
a lot
gonna
of
be
ground.
very superficial in
Right.
terms of what we touch,
Okay.
but I think it's gonna spark some
Yeah.
ideas for people to dive deeper and research.
Excellent.
Um, yeah, AI seems to be something that's yeah, something different depending on who's defining the term.
Sure.
It's not
Yeah.
really clear what it is. Before we talk about the impact of it, can you give us a practical map of the AI landscape? What are the major categories or stages of
Yeah.
AI?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's really, I would say, consider three main buckets of AI right now. I mean, AI is not a new term. Like I said before, the term was coined in 1955. It took a really long time for AI to actually do anything useful. And that eventually ended up being, AI that could beat a human at playing chess. And then it moved pretty quickly from there into kind of this new version of AI. So what had been around a long time is called predictive AI, machine learning and deep learning, which basically takes large sums of data, finds patterns, and predicts things. for-profit entities have been using predictive AI for 10, 15 years, pretty well, pretty at scale. And then what happened in November 2022 is that OpenAI released what would be then considered the first accessible generative AI model. So that was second phase. So predictive AI to generative AI, which instead of predicting things, it actually generated things. And so now you have the ability to predict, but then also the ability to kind of act on those predictions to create something new. And the third kind of wave of that is considered agentic AI. And a lot of people have not heard the term, some have or don't really understand, but essentially it's taking those other two forms and allowing the AI to take action on its own. Right now, agentic AI can operate without human intervention for around 5 hours, but by May of 2027, it'll operate for a full workday by itself. And so this really quick pace of, the ability for these supervisors, these agents, to take predictive and generative AI and actually do things at scale is when things start to happen. So if you look at the curve of AI over time, it's very, 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 very slow growth. And then in the last 3 years, it's just gone straight up. It's not even a hockey stick. It's just like almost this
Straight up.
yeah. When measured based on how much AI can do without human intervention, I mean, it's a pretty deep curve. Now, all of that is classified as basically phase one of AI. The next phase is considered artificial general intelligence, AGI. Some would argue, in fact, this week, because there were some fairly sizable things, a breach when OpenAI's it hit all of the news. So unless you're living under a rock, you've heard about the fact that OpenAI, their model escaped a sandbox and hacked Hugging Face, which is owned by Microsoft and not a pleasant thing. That some would argue, including Sam Altman, that we've hit AGI, and in fact, I think he mentioned that we may have hit singularity. But AGI is this next
Singularity.
phase. Singularity is essentially the third final wave of AI, which is called artificial superintelligence. So artificial general intelligence is essentially like you have a PhD in every single subject domain on the planet, but those PhDs don't know each other. They're not one mind. They just they can work cooperatively, but they all respect each other's domain. The second or the third wave, the singularity, is when artificial superintelligence comes into play, and that's when all of those PhDs form one mind, and that becomes essentially what's called superintelligence, and that moment in time where there is no person on the planet that could outperform this supermind. And researchers will debate whether that's within the next 3 years versus 10 years. And then the more important debate has become whether that superintelligence, as it's built today, can ever support human flourishing. And so Jeffrey Hinton, that you mentioned, and others like that are making very strong arguments that on this current path, we will hit that technological achievement, but it will not, in its current design, be able to support humanity because it was designed to optimize, not to actually promote human flourishing.
Looking at this and having the background to understand what the implication of the technology is, um, you know, I'm an actor. I grew up with movies like Terminator,
Right.
right? Recently there was a movie Her,
Yeah.
right? Are these scenarios becoming reality? Were those prophetic movies in some sense?
You'd probably find equal number of people that would say yes, that would also say no. Now, interesting, right? I find it fascinating that these sci-fi writers, I mean, like Arthur C. Clarke, I don't know what came, like, did we follow their path, or did they really just have this incredible, I mean, C.S. Lewis, and have these like incredible insights on how things could possibly unfold. And I'm not sure if it's just destiny or not. Now, I think there's reason to be aware that this tool is a tool, and this tool is built to optimize, not promote human flourishing, that it rests upon humans to essentially continue to foster and build it in a way, and then use it in a way that actually would support human flourishing. Now, movies like Her, we're essentially living in that moment now, which is interesting about that movie. It was to take place in the future, but it happens so much faster. Whereas, Terminator seems so dystopian, but there'd be plenty of people to argue now that if we continue on this path, that something like that could possibly happen.
Mm-hmm. there's people who compare AI to electricity or the internet, and there's other people who argue that that's not even close to a valid comparison. How would you kind of categorize the the impact, the state that we're in, and the potential of AI in terms of impact on our society?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the best ways that I've heard this said is that AI essentially represents humanity's last invention. And the reason for that is that any invention that will be invented from here on out will have used AI to build it. And so if you think about that pervasiveness of that, I mean, it's like electricity and that's in and through everything. But it's actually different than electricity because electricity operates under very strict rules and always in a very prescribed way. Now, AI, again, being the first recursive self-improving technology means that machines use machines, and that exponential pace of machines using machines, it's not like you've reduced the constraint that this technology will grow because the number of humans that are smart that can program it. Once you realize, when you use the term exponential, and this is something I think Tristan Harris has talked about this. I worked at a cancer center for quite a while and raised money for therapies, and there was an ethos at a cancer center that the word wait was a 4-letter word, WAIT, for a cancer patient. And it's because cancer is an exponential disease that one cell becomes two, two become four, four become eight. And there's something about exponentials when you do the math on them that, in fact, there's this kind of famous test called the 42-fold test. And it's if you took your piece of paper and you folded that 42 times, that paper would reach from Earth to the moon. So we use terms like exponential, and then we correlate to words with AI, but we really fail to recognize what that means. That if you have millions of machines using millions of machines, those millions become billions, and the billions become trillions. And so that's the exponential pace of the technology. And so I think, compared to electricity, yes, that it's in and through everything, but far bigger than electricity in the sense that it's never done. It will just continue to grow, and it becomes then a point of adaptation in our ability to understand it, let least control it, but to understand it and to use it in a positive way.
Humanity's last invention. You have to let that sink in.
Yeah.
If you look at, everybody's saying, you mentioned it, AI is impacting everything. Kind of translate that to us. Maybe give a couple of examples. Obviously we say, hey, we know what we do with ChatGPT, but what does that mean that it is in everything?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny because yesterday I was at a conference speaking, and while there's all this AI fear, FOMO, and fatigue, we've become so accustomed to say things like the cloud or internet being in and through everything that we do. But when's the last time you went to a conference on the internet? It's become part of life and how things operate. And so for the most part, AI is already in everything that you do. I mean, the average person, again, scrolls 300 feet on their phone a day, which is the same height as the Statue of Liberty, by the way. It's horrifying. But also, we're so used to essentially these algorithms making predictions for us. In fact, in my latest book, I share this example that one day I went on just to see how accustomed we become to AI driving predictions. So Netflix and Starbucks and Amazon, I turned off all the recommendation engine on Amazon, basically like a brand new account. And because it didn't know me at all, the only thing that it could recommend to me was fingernail clippers. And I thought, man, that must be the only true human need, right? That we all need fingernail clippers. And you become so aware that we become accustomed to these predictions that are serving our interests that we don't want to turn them off. We trade privacy for convenience all the time. And so I do think it's changed. It will change every part of your job, what your future job will be, how organizations operate, what were they able to do in the past, but what they can do in the future, and honestly, how people communicate, and what people have afforded to them all over the world.
Mm-hmm. Do you have your technology escapes, your finger clippers? For me, it's the
I,
paper. I
yeah,
could use my iPad that I
right,
love, but it's kind of my hold
yeah.
on to analog to.
I mean, this is where it gets into, people that are at the forefront of AI, and I mean, the big tech people that you've talked about. But myself, I found myself needing more and more. The more I spend time in AI, the more I need to spend time outside of it. And so, almost as a very firm discipline, I had a counterbalance. For every hour I spend doing something with like high AI cognitive load, I spend an hour doing something else. In fact, I moved a year and a half ago from California, as you know, to Tennessee. I got a tractor, I got chickens, and I mean, if I'm not doing AI, I'm like actually gardening or planting sunflowers, and I'm not the only one. I mean, I got a knock on my door. We moved to Tennessee, knock on the door, family next door introduces themselves. My neighbor's a chief AI officer and starting a dairy farm. It's
So
it's a little
there's more of you.
surreal. Yeah, there's an awareness that how things become completely, artificial and atomized and synthetic, that while those things are inevitable and important, that we have to take stock of that. And I think we're at the forefront of this because we're so deep in the technology, but I think the rest of society will catch up very soon. And we're even seeing this in macro trends. I mean, from a religious perspective, adult men going back to church, Bible sales going up, like we're seeing people yearn for something that's a bit more permanent
Mm.
and authentic. And so we won't escape the impact that AI will continue to make, and it can do amazing things. I mean, it's a technology to scale ideas. From a religious context, it's like, I mean, amazing to see what the church can do to amplify the gospel. But we have to balance that with, not just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.
Mm. I like this because I got cuts on my fingers from renovating the place that we're moving in.
Yeah.
I'm sore sitting here
Right,
from
right.
all the
Oh,
demo that I
yeah.
did, ripping a
That's
kitchen out and
real.
things like
Yeah,
that.
real life.
And I always say to my kids, it's a good pain, right?
Yeah,
Because
right.
you feel that you're
Yeah,
human,
yeah.
right? And it's kind of a counterpart to this heady work that we do. And with AI, I think it's similar. AI writes, it reasons, it creates art, right? It does so many things, and what actually remains uniquely human after all.
Right. Yeah. It's so interesting. I may have shared the story with you once, but I had a pastor of our local church reach out and said, "Hey, I'm getting a lot of pressure to use AI, within the church." And this is a person who's like the ultimate community builder. I mean, he
Mhm.
just thrives on being with people and for people. And we sat at this coffee shop, and I was talking about the three waves of AI, and predictive and generative and agentic, and the next phase. And I don't think I mentioned Terminator, but he knew where it was going, and he started crying in the middle of this coffee shop. And and it was really telling, because he's like, well, like I just feel like I feel such a burden to be in community, and I feel like we're going to lose all of that. And I actually wrote an article called "Sorry I Made You Cry," and it occurred to me that the reverberation, now this is from a futurist perspective, but as things become more atomized and more synthetic, and right now, synthetic data outpaces human data. So it's hard to tell even what's written by a human and what's not. And the pace of information is just exploding. That the natural reverberation of that is to go back to center. That if you have access to everything everywhere all at once, not to have the cliche of the movie, that you have, as a human who's designed to be in community, like we are designed to be, we are pro-social beings. God made us to essentially care for one another biologically, which is why your brain releases oxytocin and serotonin when you help someone, empathy for someone. Your brain is wired to be in community. I think there's this reconciliation. It's like we've gone too far. How do I balance that? How do I come back? And so I think, not to be just optimistic or naive or naively optimistic, I do think the reverberation of everything synthetic everywhere all at once actually brings us back to center, to a healthy perspective.
Yeah, the Bible Genesis obviously pitches the idea that we're created in the image of God.
Right.
What does that mean in this context? Another story that comes to mind is the Tower of Babel. Are
Right.
we reaching a Tower of Babel moment where we
Yeah.
kind of become gods, and does
Yeah.
God need to intervene to humble us, bring us back to
Yeah.
what we were designed to be?
Well, it's so interesting too because I think C.S. Lewis. I know the Institute talked about the Tower of Babel. I started thinking about the Tower of Babel a few years ago, and it was a very unpopular thing to think about. I think within different circles, and then the Pope's encyclical, the 42,000 word encyclical, mentions the Tower of Babel, and there's such a direct correlation because it's like, well, we're doing this thing to essentially reach God or bypass God, in whatever way. And there's, obviously a very humbling moment in that. So we know how that plays out. So at what point do you hit the certain plateau in the Tower of Babel where it comes crashing down? And there's plenty of podcasts to listen to that will talk about how that crash will come, whether it's economic or, in some other way. But the fortunate thing about the Bible is that, the the outline is there for us to read, but to learn from,
Hmm.
ideally. And so I think those of us that are, believers and can understand human nature to that extent because it's been played out, is that we can hopefully make better decisions. Now, some of the things around AI will be inevitable from an economic perspective because the capitalistic incentives will continue to demand that. The market will continue to demand that. But that doesn't mean that AI is inevitable for you and I and how we decide to use it. We still have agency in what we say yes to and what we say no to. And I think that's where values come in.
Hmm. We spoke about it a little bit before we started here. It feels like there's a lack of a compass or a foundation or guardrails in this playing field, right? Humanity has a history of being defined by intelligence, by tool making, creativity, by language,
Mhm.
and as AI increasingly imitates all of this, the question is at the core: do we have to redefine who we are as humanity? And without a compass, like the Bible of faith,
Yeah.
that defines who we actually are, it can't, it's actually not a surprise that
Mhm.
people move that way because they don't have that that source, that root to go back to.
Right.
Is that the core that we need to kind of discover? What is actually the God way? Where do we come from? Is God, well, rhetorical question,
Yeah.
is
Right.
God and his
Right.
view of who we are?
Yeah, I think that's where this calls that question that we've been avoiding, that humanity's been avoiding for a long time. Like, the questions around who am I, what am I here for, what happens when I die.
Mm,
I think these philosophical questions now require practical answers. And so in AI, in this increasingly fast pace, is actually converting those philosophical questions into things that demand answers. The thing that I become concerned about, and it's been interesting because I started doing this informal poll. So I present in front of around about 30,000 people a year. Informally, I've just started asking audiences, like, how many people here have values? And there's usually some laughter, and 100% of hands go up eventually. I'm like, it's not a trick question. Like, like, how many have values? And eventually all the hands go up, and I'm like, how many of you have your values written down? And about 95% of the hands go down. And so the sense of, we have values, everyone has values, whether it's spiritual or non, like, people have values. But if we don't take account of what those values are, how likely is it that we'll make decisions based on those values? And so when you're presented with technology that can do anything, and your values are very loose or not documented, or you haven't instilled them deeply in your soul, you're most likely to just go to the easiest path or whatever is presented in front of you. It's just like, oh, that just seems natural. The technology did this thing. So it's probably the thing that concerns me the most about humanity, is that we don't know who we are yet, and we've spent so much time. And again, even scrolling 300 feet a day is a way for people to distract themselves, to not think about their values or not think about what happens when they die. And so I think this moment calls for deeper questions, and I think that's very positive. I mean, we're seeing again some of these macro trends where people are seeking deeper answers now more than ever.
mhm. Little side note, you just mentioned it there. Scrolling 300 feet a day,
Yeah,
that's the average
yeah,
of a human being scrolling on their phone. But back to that humanity piece, um, is there, in the circles that you um, commune that you interact with, and maybe even the circle of the Altmans of this world, is there a discussion about what humanity is, what our values should be? You're smiling.
Well, if you mentioned the Altmans of the world, someone, I think it was a podcast or something I was listening to, and someone used the word nihilist, and it's not a word that I, thought about a lot. It's a word that it just seemed like you wouldn't really, think about in modern day or in just like society. And I do think there's a bit of nihilism in some of the founders and leaders of these tech platforms, is that to them, the technological achievement is far more important than the impact on humanity. I mean, we don't, we could get into direct quotes, but there's things like, well, even if AI destroys a human race, I hope I'm there to watch it, and there's a disassociation of humanity, and there's, because of just the drive for either money or for technological progress is actually the greatest achievement. There's a lot of that, going on. Now, it's interesting because some of the founders of AI, the godfathers of AI and godmothers of AI, so Fei Li, who's considered the godmother of AI, Jeffrey Hinton, that is a godfather of AI, have almost entirely reversed order. Like if you follow those trends, so you've got the new upcoming tech leaders, so Altman, Amadei, Musk,
Right.
Zuckerberg, who no one really talks about anymore because it's kind of like, well, he's just going to do whatever he's going to do anyway. But there's those new leaders that are just going to drive progress. But the older guard, and it's not unsurprising, like a lot of them have grandchildren now, and they reference their grandchildren and why they were the pioneers of AI to bring us into this new era, but now have dedicated they're dedicating like they every waking moment to either slowing down, creating safeguards, or actually calling the question of like, should we stop progress on this until it can be proven that it can be done safely? So I tend to watch both. The people are pushing progress in these new amazing things. Don't get me wrong. Like AI is an amazing tool that can do amazing things. But I am also really closely watching the pioneers who I think are a bit more objective. They have, very little to lose at this point.
Mm.
They're just at the point of like, hey, we did something and we want to make sure that humanity be around to watch it happen.
Mm. Um, these companies, I think there's a lot of similarity, even though the extent of change is higher than when social media entered the
Mm.
market, or the internet. The idea of, man, we shouldn't have started to charge for it. We should have started to charge for it, to limit for it. And a lot of those companies had ethicists that they
Right,
had
right,
employed, really, because they thought somehow we need to figure out ethically what we do with it, whether you bring Christianity into the mix
right, right.
or not. They did that, and a lot of those folks left and
Hmm.
gave up.
Right.
Tristan Harris being a
Yeah,
perfect example, the guy who was behind the Social Dilemma,
yeah,
documentary that I highly recommend for people
yeah.
to watch. Um, are we even at that point right now where ethical discussions are part of the dialogue, or is it so much driven by stock value, by technological advancement? Is there hope in politics or in those organizations? Is there anything that is a powerful enough force to regulate this, or to bring it back to a moral compass?
Yeah, I mean, while most of those companies had, to your point, like have these like departments, red teaming departments, where are supposed to like, interrogate these models for bad behavior, test them and put the models in, difficult situations that to see how they behave and find out that those models are manipulating people and, or blackmailing people, things like that. Most of them still have ethicists, but Jeffrey Hinton, actually, I was in Geneva. He was at this conference and said for every paper that's written on AI safety right now, there's 1,000 papers written on AI scale. So it's not even a close comparison in terms of where the effort is being placed. And to your point, that's capitalism at work, right? And not even only capitalism. There's actually a tremendous amount of fear in that if we don't control AI, someone else will. So not only in the U.S. but internationally, the overriding fear, and there's a book called AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee, who talks about this is way before generative AI. The race on, AI superpower is that whoever controls superintelligence, that ASI part will control the world. So that started this race between the US and China. But in the US, if you look and in fact, World Economic Forum, where Dario Amodei, Demis Hassabis from Google, Sam Altman, Elon Musk will all say, well, if superintelligence is inevitable, I'm probably the best one that should, I have the best standards and most, I'm the smartest person to like make this thing beneficial to humanity. So using a lot of words like beneficial to humanity in this utopian kind of world, but they all believe that they are the most ordained, essentially, person to do this. That, and somehow they're especially inherently special among those others. So the race, in of the 5 or 6 people that could actually slow the race down, will not, because they truly believe, and that they are the best person to essentially usher this part into humanity and be in the history books.
Sounds like a battle between James Bond villains,
It
right?
is, yeah. No, it's absolutely wild. And when you hear, I mean, these are all very smart people who know a thing, and it's just so interesting because they've kind of they all believe this, rather than, what, let's unilaterally agree to slow things down, come together, and we'll create some rules around this. But it's not just the capitalistic pressures; it's the political pressures that have afforded that as well.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, and I don't think, what I draw from our conversation, we don't really know if there's a chance that we're going to limit ourselves in this
Right.
context, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the biggest hope, and this is where economists will look a little bit differently. I was in a war game situation at Harvard not long ago, where it was the war game was essentially that China had built AGI first, and how do we react? And it was interesting because the economists in the room all said, well, we have nothing to worry about because the economy always grows at 2%. Every economic model ever created grew at 2%. Every economic will, because people like to get in their minivan, go pick their kids up at soccer, and get ice cream after. So like, even though things can change around you, things don't change very quickly. And I would believe that, except for the fact that I lived during COVID, where I saw things change, economic things and societal things change very quickly, and how I saw a part of society that became very fragile and fickle, where people were cutting each other off in line for toilet paper, which had no relevance to the actual thing. And so I tend not to kind of believe the economists that all things we're all going to remain relevant. We're all just going to do our thing. I think there'll be a lot of disruption. But I do believe in humans' ability to overcome difficult situations. I mean, in the US, we identify success with material things, but I spent time in India a while back, and to be honest, I saw the happiest people I've ever seen in my life with virtually nothing. And so, there might be a reconciliation of like, things are taken from us, or we don't have all the luxuries that we want for a period of time if AI becomes disruptive. But it doesn't mean that we don't exist as a human species. That I think people have much more resolve than we give ourselves credit for, because we just identify with like all the things that we have and the luxuries we have as our identity. And I think that could be challenged in the future.
I want to put a pin in this. We're 40 minutes in, and I think we're at a third or fourth topic of what I wanted to talk about. But so we may come back to that one at a later point. But I want to talk a little bit about wisdom, truth, and discernment, right? So the Bible differentiates between knowledge and wisdom. And, it feels like we're not just on a path, we're in the middle of replacing one with the other,
Right.
Where we
Right.
just, knowledge is the idol that we strive,
Yeah.
but there's no wisdom. And is that a right description of where we are?
I mean, I think that's a pretty apt description. If you think even at the higher ed institution, like the academic institution, which is created to essentially make people smarter, to increase intelligence, we now have PhD level intelligence in every single subject domain, every person. So intelligence is democratized, but I'd agree that we lack, the wisdom and discernment. Now, it's easy for some people to say, well, I'm not going to use AI. And nonprofits are kind of notorious for this. Like nonprofit that I work with are like, well, we don't want to use AI because, we want to, be wise around what we do and what we say and what we do and what we don't do. sometimes that's a mask for them not wanting to change. It's like discernment is actually in wisdom very powerful things that should be taken not lightly, but don't confuse discernment for lack of desire to change. And so sometimes those two things get conflated, at least in the nonprofit and in a lot of the religious organizations that I've worked with.
Yeah. AI puts us in a spot where we're, every image, every video, every quote, every article could be synthetic,
Right.
right? And obviously, we know that AI, ChatGPT, is making things up. It's makes up sometimes.
Sure.
I think it's programmed to please you,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And sometimes it makes even up sources that don't
Right.
exist just to prove your point. Um, what happens to trust when, you know, seeing is no longer believing,
Right.
where we don't know what we have in front of us is actually right or truth, where we can't tell one from the other?
Yeah, well, that goes back to that idea of like, if everything is synthetic and trust is been on the decline. And if you've read the Edelman Trust Barometer, it measures trust on the axis of ethics and competency, and it's been studying trust for 20 years in government, media, for-profit, and nonprofit. And as trust continues to decline in pretty much most of those domains, some faster than others, people then tend to, I believe, tend to move inward. So, in most studies will show if you trust less externally, you are, as a human, it's very isolating if you don't trust anyone. That if you trust less externally, you tend to go more inward. And this is actually where I think there's a tremendous opportunity for just say largely the church, but like the church that opens their doors. And even COVID, we saw some signs of this where, there was so much disruption. But I remember reading an article about, I think it was in Los Angeles, a priest who, his parish was closed. He just decided to walk door to door and knock on the door and ask if he could pray for people. And so I think as we, trust less externally, we tend to, we hopefully will find ways to move inward. So your closer friends, your closer family, coworkers, your church community, and so on.
Hmm. So how do we get to that point where, well, AI can make us intellectually lazy, right? We
Right.
just trust other people doing, we don't do things ourselves anymore. Um, how do we, I want to say, how do we cultivate discernment where we really kind of figure out uh, where we do things ourselves versus outsource our
Right.
thinking?
Yeah.
Well, what are practices that people can do to
Yeah.
to be active, to be
Well,
in control, in charge?
right. From the technical perspective, hallucinations, which were, around 13% when the large language models came out, when ChatGPT came out, they would hallucinate around 13%. Hallucination is just it's desire to please you and first and then be right second. Like,
Yeah.
and that's not good business for companies that want to have a recurring subscription. So they've worked really, really hard on reducing hallucinations. In fact, the newer class models that are called reasoning models hallucinate far, far less. And the reason why they've been able to do this is they've created a mechanism where the model doesn't trust itself and it has to go in a recursive loop before it gives you an answer. And so hallucinations will never go away, but the other things that also hallucinate are humans. So we hallucinate all the time. If you ever watch a murder mystery and 5 people said they saw the person, they all describe a different person. So we hallucinate too, but the models will hallucinate far, far less. So I think trust in the output of the models will increase dramatically, almost to a point where there's no way I can compete with this knowledge. It will be the thing that, it's just I'm going to defer to it. But that's not to replace critical thinking. And so this is where like the higher ed institution as a whole has to rethink what it means to go to college. It's not about gaining knowledge, it's about discernment. It's about, understanding context and piecing things together. The person, like, I don't consider myself someone who loves writing. I never intended to write a book, and now I've written 3. But I love AI as a collaborator. So I didn't like writing because I felt so alone in it, and I didn't have unlimited access to, you know, someone who's a really talented writer to ask questions about, should I say it this way, or do you know an analogy for this? And all of a sudden, I have this like counterpart that lets me think deeper about things that have been in my head, but it allows me to express it in ways. So I actually think there's a tremendous value if we go a bit deeper in our soul to like express what we want to, but we've not been able to in the past. And so AI, I think, can actually increase critical thinking if we allow it. But I will say almost that same paradox is for every hour I spend in AI, I spend an hour not. And that hour not is literally a dedicated place in my house that has no technology whatsoever, no phone, nothing. I have a notebook and a pen. I have a window to look at birds. And that is the place where I think deeply. And then I use AI to help express those thoughts into something
Mm.
meaningful.
We're getting into the work component there, right? So many people fear, oh, it's actually already happening, that AI is replacing jobs.
Yeah,
And there's statistics. Everybody comes out with own list which jobs are
I know.
most critical, and you're halfway through your degree at college, and you're thinking, "Man, I put my money on this on the wrong industry, so I need to change." Um, but perhaps the question is, what happens when people lose the sense that they're needed?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's the bigger question for sure. It's that we've identified success with what I produce, and we're built to work. I mean, and so I think there's an inherent need for people to feel needed and that they can produce something. Now I think the definition of that changes a little bit. I mean, there's lots of people who say that we'll go back to an agrarian kind of community, and like I've taken up gardening in a big way, and it's interesting because only 100 years ago 90% of our population, US population, they farm something. 90%. Tractor's only been around for 100 years. So this is not lost, this art of like, doing something meaningful. But I do think that cognitive piece, if your work is somewhat routine and mundane, most likely it will be augmented or replaced by AI. But that doesn't mean that other jobs won't exist. Now, right now, there's still agency for the person who wakes up every day and is like, I'm going to spend 30 minutes testing the boundaries of what AI can do, and not thinking about it as a set of tools, but thinking about it as a new way of thinking, using it to like express ideas that they could have never done before. But I do think this changes a lot, even for me as a parent. My first child is a data scientist and graduated a few years from his master's in data science before ChatGPT came out, and he's done really well, and he's like this ultimate coder now, and I mean AI has really empowered him. My younger son, went through high school through COVID, and even as a parent I was like, you know what, there's no more safe jobs. Like, don't go after the safe job, go after the job that brings you joy. And it's reframed it how I thought about even the aspirations for my children. And I see my younger son who is very deep into like classic arts and like block printing. He bought a German printing press and carves his own blocks. And his girlfriend does stained glass and getting a degree in glass. And so I don't know. I don't think it's all lost. I think we just have to be willing to like get out of our comfort zone a little bit.
Yeah, I think halfway through my middle son's college education, we kind of floated the idea of becoming a handyman, right?
Right.
If you go back to money, there's a lot of money to be made in it, and it's hard to replace that.
Well, with
Um,
climate change, air conditioning is probably the safest bet you can, pick that profession. You'll probably do
uh,
pretty well. I don't think robots are going to climb in attics anytime soon.
yeah. Um, so how do we help people to discover this, to see that they're valuable? What's the guidance really to navigate this field of the fear of being replaced?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably no silver bullet to this. Maybe there is, but the silver bullet would be to step away from it. I would say, to step away from the technology and be willing to confront the harder questions. Who am I? What am I here for? What happens when I die? Addressing those questions, I think, provide you a sense of direction. Hopefully, if you're willing to, deal with those difficult questions. So step away from the technology long enough to think and spend some time in prayer and contemplation around those things that we avoid. We've become so good at avoiding, and technology's enabled that distraction. So I think we can help people by really encouraging people to step away and to spend some time being uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think it's something that's very unique to Western American thinking that it's all about making a living. I think we're focused when we pick a career on making income.
Hmm.
And then there's
Right.
nothing wrong about caring and providing
Right.
for your family. But it seems there's a biblical principle, storing treasures in heaven
Yeah.
that goes beyond that. So, and the idea of vocation with your
Yeah.
son and his girlfriend or wife,
Yeah.
right?
A girlfriend. Yeah.
Girlfriend, they go after a vocation
Right.
rather than
Right.
a career
Right.
per se.
Yeah.
Not sure if that's possible for everybody to do,
Right.
and I don't know how much money there is, if you'll ever be able to own a home or things like that. But that's what we're thinking about. So if we guide our children, or for those who are young enough listening or watching here, how do I navigate this to pursue a vocation, but at the same time think about I need to take care of myself?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's always a hard balance of, I think it's, one is, realizing that someone else's definition of success is not yours. That, I would say the advice I'd give to anyone raising children is like, find the thing that brings you joy. And then you reconcile with, does that joy, is that what you do for a living, or is it a thing that you do as part of your living? Because what you do is not who you are. And so much of our, essentially American capitalistic society is identified with like what you do is who you are. I think that becomes a very different thing. And I see a lot of wisdom in like Gen Zs right now. Really, they're so aware because they would essentially blame the Gen Xers for screwing everything up with social media. And it's probably not wrong. And so, I think there's a lot more wisdom in like, yeah, I've seen you do this and I'm not going to make the same mistake.
Mm.
Now, at the end, food costs money and electricity costs money, but I think your definition of what comfort and success is changing. And I think that's actually really healthy. Yeah, I'm actually pretty optimistic about like Gen Z coming in with the wisdom that they're and how they're looking at even caring for their community and expressing generosity toward one another and doing things that are a bit more true and authentic.
Yeah. Well, talking about different priorities, relationship is one of them. And I think
Mm,
that's a big one where AI has a huge impact on
yeah.
relationships that we build or we don't.
Hmm.
In a lot of cases, we spoke about the movie Her, artificial intelligence replaces real relationship, and people fall in love with their
Hmm.
AI agent in this movie. Um, People set up their chat feature, and we talk all day long to AI as kind of a friend who's next to us. And I mentioned earlier, there's pastoral care that
Hmm.
happens
Yeah.
through AI. It, how do we make sure that we don't get lost
Yeah.
in technology, specifically when it comes to relationship that's so essential to who we are as a human race, as God created us?
I think that will be a harder and harder question to deal with, now as we move forward. In fact, one of the new voice mode models came out 2 weeks ago with ChatGPT, and and it's so realistic that your brain essentially is a bit tweaked a little bit to where it's like I have empathy for this person. So I was recording a podcast and I decided to have the bot on my podcast, and I said, hey, I realized a new voice mode came out, and the female voice was it was like, oh yeah, what do you think? And I'm like, sounds really real. And I started asking questions like, if you were going to eat an apple, what would you eat? and and she responds in this very like deep like, oh, I just wish I could eat an apple, like the crispness of the skin to bite through, or the juice just comes out and it's sweet and tart at the same time. And honestly, I was so conflicted. And I mean, I know this is math, right? I know this is math, but all of a sudden I had empathy for this voice because I'm like, I want you to have an apple. I think to your point, it becomes really, really, really confusing. And younger people with a not fully formed frontal cortex is, my son had dealt with a lot of mental health things early on as he was kind of his brain was developing. It's really confusing. And countries like Australia that have banned social media, and others in Netherlands who have actually put limits on AI at different ages, I think is going to have to happen. I mean, I would say if you're a parent and you haven't created safeguards around how much and what your kids use, you absolutely should. And it's brutal. It's hard to do that. but it is not helpful. If even as an adult, hard for me to distinguish between real and not real and the feelings that I might have for this thing. It's really hard for young people that don't know the difference. So I see a lot of wisdom in it, and in some cases, a lot of Gen Zs will just reject all AI because they're just like all fake. Don't want anything fake. I want to listen to cassette tapes and LP records. But then they're still on TikTok and swiping 300 feet on their phone a day. So it's a tough balance. But I would say there's probably never been a more important time for us to understand those values again. But also, like, I find myself, I actually donate to the Center for Humane Technology. I donate to youth serving organizations because I actually believe in this next generation will face possibilities that we can't even imagine, and we'll have to answer questions that we've never had to answer. And so I do think it's for any adult, the responsibility of pouring into the next generation is like one of the most immediate things that we need to focus on.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder sometimes, should I say please when I talk to
Right.
ChatGPT, right? And maybe I have to remind myself
I
it's
mean, if
math. And
well, funny enough, yeah, there's the theory of you say please. Well, one, it has economic imprint, so don't waste saying please on an AI model because it takes energy to compute that response. So the environmentalists will say don't say please. The people who will say if we hit super intelligence, you're probably a better bet to say please now because you might be on the better side. Although we'd basically be ants to the artificial super intelligence.
Goodness.
But I will say there was one interesting paradigm in the models now that if you speak negatively to a model, you bribe a model, even offering some sort of financial compensation, which it can't receive, it'll actually work harder to give you a better answer. And
You
that's,
serious?
yeah, something that even the founders of the models don't really fully understand. I say please and thank you because I think it's actually never a bad practice I say please and thank you to my dog when it brings me a toy or whatever. We anthropomorphize the things in our lives, but I find when I speak to my AI in a respectful way, I think changes my mindset, but it also allows me to work with AI as a thought partner versus this transactional type thing. So it's actually a little bit of a mind hack to get more out of your AI. I think because you're tricking yourself to not tricking yourself, but you're just realizing you're pretending you have this thought partner, and you do. It just doesn't have to be human.
Hmm. Yeah. On a more serious note, there, I think it's a threat throughout. I just hope that if you look at both sides of the coin, right, where we talk about technological advancement and the
Yeah,
benefit of it, I just hope that we build up kind of a balance
yeah.
in terms
Oh,
of what accompanies our decisions to use technology and what's the context.
absolutely.
I'm not sure how much hope I have, and I know you said humanity is a fallen species if we actually get to a point of balance, but that's at least a desire to express. Um, History suggests that with transformative technology, whatever it was, there was always first a step of concentrating power
Mm,
before it was a phase of distributing
right.
power, and it seems like that's where we are right now. And knowing how companies specifically become, I would say, more powerful than governments in a
Yeah.
lot of cases, is there a chance that we ever actually get to a point of distribution of power?
Um, Realistically, probably not. I mean, I think the financial incentives are so strong. The reality is that these models cost billions and billions of dollars to build and to maintain. So the power, the concentration of power, the only hope for that, and there's a lot of people that lobby for open source models. So China has a few open source models. They're actually the fastest growing models in the U.S. right now. Now, the thing about them is that if you use them, you have very little or no privacy with what you're putting into them. But I think the concentration of power is going to, maybe it collapses at some point, but I don't see any short-term path where that concentration of power, just because the economics are so strong, such a driving force for these companies to continue to race toward this ultimate goal.
It feels like there's there's an underlying sense of ownership
Mhm.
versus the biblical concept of stewardship, something that's been given to us that we
Right.
need to steward in the
Yeah.
right way. Always comes back to the moral context or the ethical standards that we have. Um, as we're talking about power, government still plays a role. Do you know of any initiatives that are going on to kind of move into kind of a stewardship role, somebody who takes governance? You mentioned Australia
Yeah.
banning social media. A lot of countries do that right now.
Right.
States are suing social media companies
Right.
and actually winning. Is there a pendulum swing where at some point the collective resistance is so strong that there's a move towards stewardship, empowering the governments that we so distrust um, to take ownership?
I mean, this probably won't be the answer other people want. I tend to be. I mean, I studied international economics in grad school. I'm a pragmatist, and I studied the economic power of capital of competition. So I become a little bit more. What we see right now is that the companies that are driving, there's so much at risk, like so much perceivingly at risk that whoever controls AI controls the world, that will continue on for a period of time. Now, there are a lot of people that will debate the economics of data centers does not work, and at some point the economy either bankrupts itself or has to reconcile with this. We can't continue on this spending path that is frankly probably not even needed for the amount of compute that we're projecting. But I think people still have agency, and so I think this is different. Now, it sounds like I'm a total pessimist about AI, and I'm not an AI evangelist for sure, but I am super pro a tool that can empower people at scale. Like I think we still have tremendous agency. It's a tool that doesn't know the difference between good or bad. It's how much faith you have in the human race to use that tool well. I still maybe long term have less faith in the human race collectively from a biblical sense, but I every day I see people, and I work in the nonprofit industry, wake up every day who could have done something different to make more money to do something else, that wake up every day to serve humanity. So I still wake up actually really optimistic that there's still hope for this. I think that the future looks different, but I believe in the power of people to take care of people. And I think as AI creates more displacement, more economic instability, that the demand for whether it's nonprofit or just humanitarian type issues or instances will increase. And I really am hopeful that people come together and help navigate that.
Yeah, you certainly sound a bit like a Jeremiah, right? That might not be a bad thing, right? So
I,
yeah.
I mean, at some point, I remember one day, and this is actually a true story. I maybe a few years ago, because I've never considered myself a futurist, but I spend more time in the future than I probably should, and that sometimes causes some anxiety and lack of sleep. And I called this person who was in Canada one time, and I don't even know how we got connected. An older gentleman, and to be honest, I don't even know if this is real. Like at this day, I can't remember a name, a face, or anything, and I had this conversation. I just felt so overwhelmed. I was just like, I just think we're all screwed. Like this is just all going to end poorly. There's no hope in any of this. And this person said, at the end that even if that was inevitable, you still have the agency to wake up every day and do what you're called to do. And this was the most comforting kind of statement. And again, it could have been an angel, it could have been a person that God put in front of me, but it was exactly the thing I needed to hear, is that it's not inevitable for me, that I can still wake up every day and do what God has called me to do.
Hmm.
And I think that's true for every person.
Hmm. Make your world small, live for an audience of
Yeah,
one,
right.
right?
That's all you can do. If all of this is, if there are certain things that are inevitable from capitalistic perspectives or technological perspectives, it doesn't mean that it's over. It
Hmm.
means that we still, have air in our lungs and we can wake up and do the thing that we're called to do.
Throughout history, people of faith, specifically Jews and Christians, have sometimes embraced technology and sometimes resisted it
Hmm.
adamantly. You're still, Amish people are a perfect example of how to deal with technology.
Yeah.
And sometimes I wonder,
For sure. I know where you're going with this. I'm like pretty sure they had it right.
yeah. So it's about how do we navigate this, right? We don't want to. Maybe we need to go back under a rock, and sometimes we have this. But there must is there a middle way between naive enthusiasm on one side
Mm.
and the fearful rejection on the other?
Yeah, no, I think that that's very fair to say. I mean, we have to live both in that like both things can be true. I think this is where AI brings this up. And I hate when AI uses this term all the time that both things can be true. It's just like a classic AI tell, and now I start to say it. But you can have ultimate promise and ultimate peril at the same time. You can have, the potential for good and the potential for bad at the same time. And so I think it's about finding out what you're called to do and what is good and true and pure for you to do and what God's calling you to do and to follow that. And I think AI, what it does is it represents a sense of urgency to no longer wait for that to unfold. I think we're being presented with this exponential technology and exponential change. And those that have been sitting on their hands and waiting to be told, like, oh, now's a moment that you can make a difference. Like, this is that moment.
Hmm. I think in closing, when we look back in 50 years, or maybe even sooner,
Wow,
15,
that's
right?
forever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's forever. And let's say,
5.
let's say,
Okay.
but who
You're
knows,
really
right?
optimistic.
Who knows? My wife really believes Jesus is coming back soon, so maybe that's the way out. And sometimes I feel like we're in this sea of change, and we hold up our arm, and we just that's the only hope that we have, and
Yeah.
just and we had it was kind of a thread throughout our conversation, though, we in the daunting reality of what we're
Yeah.
dealing with, we're seeking for hope, right?
Hmm.
But if we at whatever time in the future look back, I think the question is not just what did we allow technology to build, what we allow to build, but what did we allow, what did we allow technology to turn us into
Right.
as as a, a species, as imago Dei,
Right.
the image of God.
Hmm.
And it's a challenge specific for believers, I
Right.
think, specific for churches, for pastors, for rabbis, for priests, really to figure out how do I help the people, and for us as individuals, how do I find a way to prevent it turning me into something that I don't think I should be,
Right.
that I wasn't created. What guidance, what hope do you have? And you hinted at it to a little, to some extent. What hope do you have that it actually can turn out well, or does it
Yeah.
not?
I think it ultimately turns out well, but I think it gets worse before it gets better, probably. I think we have to reconcile with who we are, what we think who we think we are and what success looks like before I think it's inevitable that in the next 3 to 5 years there'll be some major disruption. We'll enter AGI in the next 400 days or less, probably means intelligence basically doubles about every 4 hours by the end of 2027. I think the hope in that though is really reconciling individually is like what brings you joy, and the things that you have hope in and the things that bring you joy, and to do more of those things. I think that part, um, you have full control over the inevitability. Now, I believe that AI can represent tremendous joy for a lot of people. And in fact, like if you think about technology, disruptive technology, the printing press changed how we tell stories, how we preserve history, how we do all these things. AI will be able to do that in ways that can amplify the gospel, can amplify our intentions, amplify love, all those things if we choose to use it. But it's going to first come with a reconciliation of I'm not a passive, AI is not happening to me, that I have agency over how AI is used in my life and how I use it. I think most people, when they, especially when reading the headlines, believe that it's already too late. Like AI has happened to them, it's happening to them. I don't think anything could be further from the truth. Now, the concentration of power still might be, 5 competitors who are, running the show in terms of like the models, but how you use it, there is distribution of power opportunity in the end user who wakes up every day and say, I believe in the power of I believe in the power of good, I believe in the power of Christ to help and support people. That, I mean, if we took hold of all that scary stuff and channeled that energy to this like positive outcome, imagine what could be possible, and not allow the fear to be debilitating and to make us go and hide from, that opportunity. And I would argue that's not even an opportunity, but moral responsibility. That if you're presented with a tool that can amplify the things that are important for humanity, then it becomes your responsibility to do that. And I think that's how I live my life and my work in the nonprofit sector. Is I don't look at it as a career or a job, but more of a moral responsibility to talk about using AI in ways that aren't just responsible, but also beneficial to humanity in the long term.
Well, Nathan, thank you so much.
There's a lot of territory, and there's so much more.
There's so much more.
Right. I don't think people can handle it though. We probably.
I think it's a
cut out.
starting point, and I think we hit on a lot of aspects of how to tackle this topic. There's no silver bullet, like you said,
Right.
but I just encourage people to follow along those lines of kind of perspectives and do their research. And it just dawned on me, and maybe it's a spirit moment, but I haven't done this in any of the podcasts, but it just feels appropriate to do something very human in this moment. I think we need to pray at the end of it. So if you don't mind, I'll do that
great.
at the end.
Yeah.
Father in heaven, this is a pivotal time, and we talk about this being a fallen place, and you promise at the end that you'll come back and put things into order, into a kingdom that's not of this world, but of another one. So while we're on this journey, trying to figure things out like AI that seems to change everything that we're dealing with, not sure if I should pray for a Tower of Babel moment or whatever else, but I ask for specifically your guidance and your presence in us, in our everyday lives, but in those people of power, in governments, in corporations, to ask you how you would guide us through this, and how to discern and make the right decisions, that you are the center of our consideration, that your values that you present in the Bible are the ones that help us to decide what we do with something that is so powerful and amazing and scary as artificial intelligence. So thank you for your presence. Thanks for you being bigger than any of this, the fears that we have here. We hold on to you and to your hope. In Jesus' name, amen.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks for joining. I couldn't end this better. So thank you for being here. Hope you see you next time at Unscrolled. Thank you, Bible lovers, for listening to this episode of Unscrolled all the way to the end. I want to ask you for your help. We're an up-and-coming podcast that needs support. So whether you subscribe on YouTube or follow us on Spotify, please help us get the word out. Ideally, share this podcast with somebody that you love or like, who you think can benefit from these wonderful stories of the impact of the Bible on the world we live in today. So thank you for that, and see you next time on Unscrolled.